interrupt at that point. You say socialism is impossible in a technical sense. Now, what exactly do you mean by that?
It proposes a solution which is not the solution. You cannot. Well, it takes a long time, but it's my central problem. Socialism assumes that all the available knowledge can be used by a single central authority. It overlooks.
Venezuelans started their day in search of food, expecting to see the usual grim queues that form at government stores. Not today. The only stores with
to show that we stand together united in our commitment to climate justice. We are the majority. And we demand change.
Because it is one thing for government to plan and to control an economy for a single overriding objective, one solitary objective, win the war. It's a very different thing for government to control the economy, for the many numerous tastes of all of us, of a very large number of people in a complex world. And you asked the question of whether people's opinions can be changed. Yes. I can't change their opinions, you can't change their opinions, but experience is changing their opinions. Is there anybody anywhere now who believes that government is an efficient way to run an industrial enterprise?
I think your question, can you get the genie back into the bottle, is a very important one. It is undoubtedly true.
As unfortunate as it is to say, having described the economic calculation problem on profits and losses, as well as on a variety of options in relation to resources and production, and the brief role prices play in the economy, even this argument seems to be too difficult for some to understand, and with two recent arguments from critiques, I feel the argument needs to be broken down further into simplified language to explain the faults of their arguments. As I covered in a previous video on profits and losses, there seems to be a misconception, not only the role this information plays, but how it comes about. An example of this misunderstanding is Paul Cockshot's argument relative to the use of technology, claiming that technology and mathematical equations can debunk this argument. As I've explained many times before, prices are signals, not obstacles to getting things that you want, and it is from the information of price signals that tell us valuable information, especially on relative scarcity. What is scarcity? Scarcity simply means that people's expectations far exceed what is actually available to them, and that resources are not infinite, they are finite. Whilst it may be true that there may be more of a specific given resource out there in the world, much of that resource has not been found in existence. Therefore, it is not factored into resource quantity. You cannot factor in what you don't know exists. After all, it may not exist. You may only have what is left on this planet Earth for what we currently are aware of. Since resources are finite and there is only so much of that resource in existence, and since people's expectations far exceed the quantity of resource available to them, this is what we mean by scarcity. I recently had an argument from a Marxist critic, Vicky1999, patronising myself on scarcity.
So we need to somehow manage who gets stuff and who doesn't. And then he says
that when it comes to people who support socialism, they don't understand these fundamental basic things.
So, basic economics lesson 2, there aren't infinite resources, you silly socialist. There just isn't enough food for everybody. We need to hold on to the free market and let 8 million starve each year. We just don't have food.
The proof he has never studied fundamental basic economics is that he doesn't understand the introduction to economics, why the study of economics exists, the question of what economics is about. As I explained previously, the study of economics is not about the stock market, or a question of how you run business, or even about finances, although that plays a role in the economy. Rather, it is a question of our place on this earth with scarce natural resources and how we better improve the material living standards of the masses whilst using the fewest resources as possible. In other words, how do we achieve lifting the most people out of poverty in the most efficient way possible? So, why the fewest resources possible? Why not mass produce so there's enough to go around everyone? The reason is because this isn't based on the real world of economics. Resources are scarce, and the major problem socialism is faced with is that each and every single resource doesn't just have one usage. Therefore, there are alternative uses for each resource available. Take for example each resource of the different types of wood, whether it is oak, birch, pine, maple, etc. Each individual option of wood resource has alternative uses. There are 1,000,001 different products out there produced by oak or birch, or maybe even pine. I will explain the fatal flaw in this argument, but all you need to understand is that the reason why the study of economics exists is because resources are finite and we must economise to ensure we aren't wasting valuable scarce resources. If resources were not finite, if they were infinite, why would you need to economise? You wouldn't. Therefore, there would be no need for the study of economics. Yes, economics is also a study about analysing given policies, whether short-term or long-term, and analysing their given effects on the economy. And in the study of economics, there are trade-offs. That is to say that in relation to scarcity, there is no such thing as a utopia where you can meet the needs and wants of everyone. That is impossible. Thomas Sowell covered this argument in his book Basic Economics, where he addresses an example of beachfront housing. In his scenario, hypothetically speaking, suppose there was only one beachfront and 70 million people living on that land. The quantity of space of this beachfront is not infinite, therefore there is only so much quantity of space available. Therefore, in relation to building beachfront homes, there is only so much in quantity you can build, given that there is only so much space available to you. You could build a large quantity of beachfront houses on that beachfront, but it will never meet the needs of 70 million people. Since there is only one beachfront, that underlying reality of scarcity means that only a certain given number of people can live in them. This is where the role of prices comes into it, because if you do not have the information of prices, how then does the central planner under socialism determine who gets to live in those houses? They can't have everyone living in them. There's only one beachfront and there's not enough space or quantity of housing to match that demand. So since you're left in a scenario where not everyone can live in those beachfront houses, and if you have no prices, how else are you going to determine who gets to live in those houses? The answer? Favouritism. Prices therefore enable us to ration such resources efficiently. When you have 70 million people, with the reality of scarcity of beachfront housing, the price of such housing drives up. The price signal isn't a statement of greed, as socialists wrongly tell you. It is a signal telling the market there is a shortage. As I explained in a previous video on the economic calculation problem on profits and losses, I briefly touched upon the information we gather from that. There was some information, however, that I left out as I felt I could cover it in a different topic issue all on its own, and that is in relation to consumer preference and behavioural patterns. As I've explained before, price is largely determined through the laws of supply and demand. Much like the quantity of beachfront housing, it is in shortage and supply to the superior quantity and demand. The higher price is a signal signifying a shortage and lower price and abundance. Much like I explained before in response to ContraPoints, price is not determined by business owners, but by what consumers are willing to pay for something. Like the example of the $2,000 gold pizza. Although to your consumer preference, you would never spend that sort of money on a pizza. Some people might, and in order for for a business to keep such pizzas on their shelves at a $2,000 price, this information conveys that there must be people out there buying those pizzas. So long as there is demand, the business can sell it at that price. If demand falls, however, that business is forced to reduce the price. You cannot stick a gun to consumers' heads and say, you must buy this. The point of this explanation is that the economic reality to acknowledge that price is determined by what consumers are willing to pay for something, not because of greed or because a business set the price. If that were the case, a business could set their prices to $100,000. Socialists find it incomprehensible how complex society is. Never mind the fact that each and every single individual of society all have different needs and wants. Kevin D. Williamson, in his book The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, touches upon an example of milk production as he says, unquote, "Some people, such as vegans or the lactose intolerant, consume no milk, but some households consume large quantities of the drink. Those with many kids, those who use lots of milk products in their cooking, etc. Others may consume varying amounts. In July, when it's hot and humid, a family might prefer lemonade, but it might consume a lot of milk in August if it's whipping up a bunch of ice cream for a big family reunion." Off quote. In other words, socialists have an oversimplified view of this planet, of humanity. They think it is just a case that if you centrally plan production, the people just all come together and collectively decide how much is needed for the collective, and then ask. They don't stop to question the fact that some people may use a resource more than other people, like milk. To further explain the complexity the socialist doesn't comprehend, Kevin D. Williamson goes on to say, unquote, "In addition to quantity calculations, there are various questions to answer to. Whole milk or skimmed? 1% or 2%? Do you prefer more expensive organic milk or cheaper factory farmed milk? And if you prefer the pricier organic stuff, how much more are you willing to pay for it? What about soy milk, chocolate milk, the delicious Pennsylvania Dutch treat known as vanilla milk?" Off quote. As you can see, there are a variety of different options that you have to centrally plan for, and if you have 70 million people to plan for, factoring in some households consume more. Yes, I explained previously, even in relation to Mao the Infidel on the Labour theory of value, about time preference and how consumer demand changes, but what I did not explain was that certain unexpected events may pop up and people's plans may change. Kevin D. Williamson explains this with the example of a planned birthday party that may be 6 months from now. But how do you plan for such a party? How do you know how many people are going to show up? Nothing is definitive. So how do you plan how much you spend to organise for it? Even then, the event may get cancelled due to unfortunate circumstances.
Board have issued a statement basically saying that they've decided that the Championships 2020 will be cancelled, so not postponed. They're not even bothering to push it back.
The socialist does not think about the individual preference. In their worldview, production is simplified and there is no detailed explanation as to how they plan for such a vast number of options for a vast number of different demand. If you use the example of planning for events, whether it is a large-scale event the country may have, or events in each individual city, or small-scale events across thousands upon thousands of different families and friends across a 70 million populated country, how then do you plan production to meet those demands? The point being, a central planner would then have to work out production for each and every single event and the quantity of production. The issue being, people change their minds persistently. It is like I explained, just because you want something now doesn't mean to say you want it 6 months from now. Look at the rapid change in technology. A company like DJI or camera companies like Canon or Nikon come out with new cameras every year. It's an ever-changing market. Of course, we could touch upon the problem socialism is faced with regards to the knowledge problem relative to prices being unable to technologically improve due to the absence of market-driven prices. We saw that with British Rail, with the outdated trains as a result of nationalisation. Likewise, the cars in Cuba, it wasn't a fashion statement, that's the price you pay for living in the absence of market-driven prices. This is the issue with the socialist mindset. It doesn't factor in the complexity of the human mind that no technology could ever match. You may create artificial intelligence, but even that is programmed and controlled to a varying degree. The human mind is the most fascinating complex organ to exist. Isn't something technology could ever read without opening up our heads and tampering with our brains physically, and that's going down the road of the Orwellian nightmare. In relation to this, if a specific resource ends up in shortage, i.e. oakwood, this will push the price up automatically of all oakwooden products across the entire economy. The reason this higher price signal is so important is because it can disincentivize consumers from overspending on produce where that specific given resource is in shortage. That then creates that incentive for consumers to seek alternative resources for that same type of produce, allowing the market to replenish resource stock of oakwood. As I noted in one of the previous videos on the economic calculation problem in relation to variety of options, I touched upon the example of butter, yogurt and ice cream in relation to milk. You could use cheese as an example in relation to milk. In this example, whether you talk about cheese, yogurt, ice cream or even butter, all four of these products are made from milk. If you have a large scale economy like Great Britain with 70 million people and you are having to plan for millions of households across Great Britain, you need to know what is more in demand of that specific given time period. For example, as I explained in response to Mouthy Infidel, Florida may demand ice cream all year round, but in New York, where the winters may become terrible as temperatures plummet, demand for ice cream would not be the same. So imagine it was winter time in the United States. You can't just assume that the entire continent to plan for, with over 100 million households, all want ice cream at that specific given time period. And it's not a case of just producing a large quantity of all four of these products because consumer demand fluctuates. Also, some produce may be in higher demand than others. Ice cream may be in greater demand than yogurt, therefore you can't just guess and use the milk resource by allocating it into production for each item. What if you allocate milk into producing yogurt in a period where demand isn't there? If the socialist argues, but we know demand is there because we're seeing people buying it, they don't, because no one stands around all day every day assessing what is being sold most of. The truth is, the only reason the market knows the information of what is in greater demand is through the information of prices, because when consumer demand drives up for that product, the price drives up with it, creating the incentive for the producer to produce more. The higher price is the information which allows us to rationally calculate and allocate the resource of milk to the correct parts of the market. If there were to be a shortage of milk, the price would rise for that resource, and with that, so would the four other products: cheese, butter, yogurt and ice cream. This is what we mean by relative scarcity, what products are scarce in relation to what other given produce. If however you completely remove the information of prices and you no longer hold the information of profits and losses, you're screwed, because there is no information there to tell you what is in greater demand. Now, remember, much like milk and the variety of different options available, Kevin D. Williamson pointed out it is no different to the variety of options of butter, yogurt, ice cream or cheese. You aren't just dealing with four simplified products, you then need to know the information of how much the resource of milk you're going to use in each and every single option available. You counter in those hundreds of different options. How do you know what type of cheese is in greater demand? or not, if not for prices. Just like milk, you're going to need to know what milk you're going to use. You now see how oversimplified socialists view the economy. If any central planner tells you they know that information, they are lying to you. Having watched both critique videos by Vicky1999 or Mouth the Infidel, neither of them understand prices and the damage caused by government price controls. If you're to have central planning, then what must follow is the planning of what the price may be. Even if they argue for a moneyless based economy, they will still be faced with the economic calculation problem. Two notable problems that follow with price fixing above or below market value are price floors and price ceilings. In response to Mouth the Infidel, I addressed Chile's problems with socialism and their relative price shortage problems, as well as Venezuela. Have a listen to his claims.
One, he's factually incorrect. His timeline is wrong. He says that the US didn't get involved with Chile until 73, when in fact we have extensive government documents showing that we were massively involved in Chile as early as 63. So his argument there is completely incorrect. Secondly, in the case of Venezuela, he says the US didn't get involved economically until 2017, when in fact the US had Saudi Arabia ramp up oil production, which caused a rut in the Venezuelan economy as early as 2014, which is again before Scotty said the US became involved.
As I could go into full-blown detail on price ceilings and price floors with their detailed examples to show for the economic failure of socialism, it would far extend beyond this argument on the economic calculation problem, and we'll address that separately. But for now, all one needs to understand is that the likes of Mouth the Infidel and Marxists in general do not understand basic economics. They don't understand what prices are, the role of prices, or what consequences follow their centrally planned price fixing. As I stated, central planning entails the planning of prices in the economy. They would never accept the market-driven prices, where price would be determined by consumer demand. They couldn't anyway, as that is capitalism. However, the main reason they couldn't is because when shortage naturally occurs in the economy and market-driven prices drive up, because the socialist doesn't understand prices, they think the higher price exists because of greed, as if to say someone merely threw the price up just to shaft the consumer. What is also important to note, the economic calculation problem doesn't just pertain to the argument against socialists on central planning, although we know this is a big part of what defines socialism. Even if socialists try to argue for the moneyless-based economy, the inevitable consequences are the same. It is for this reason I have detailed to explain this in greater detail in a simplified explanation. The predicated idea surrounding Paul Cockshot's argument among some other socialist thinkers is that since human beings cannot possibly know all of the available information out there of every product out there on the market, and cannot possibly work out the calculation on how much to produce, socialists have this assumption that advanced technology through mathematical equations can mastermind to finally solve the problem once and for all. Society is made up of individuals, therefore individual preference. The difference in demand from one consumer to that of another are vast, and if you neglect individual demand, which socialism does, the inevitable consequence in socialist production, you will find you may benefit one group of people but neglect a great many more. So how then do you fulfill the needs and wants of every individual of society? How do you plan production for 70 million people when you have trillions of different products out there? The truth is, the only rational way you could ever determine production to meet the demand from 70 million different individuals is by allowing the individual to freely choose for themselves. So what is the problem with collective decision making? If you have ever worked collectively with a group of people, you always find there are sacrifices to be made. Therefore, the individual preference is sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number. The secondary point, there is no personal ownership in socialism. The word personal pertains to the individual, and socialism is defined by communal ownership of property. Communal ownership, which is collective ownership, isn't about individuals owning their own possessions, like the example of the starving time prior to the Industrial Revolution in North America. We saw the pilgrims die due to starvation and disease. The primary cause of the starving time was identified by the absence of secure private property rights. In collective decision-making process, you will always find the sacrifice. You can even find this conflict from your personal experience if you have worked in groups.
Stop humming that song!
I can hum if I want to.
That means individual preference results in the group constantly at conflict with each other, and in order for the group collective decision to be made, the sacrifice of individuals who disagree must be sacrificed. Christian Yemius, in his book titled Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, explains perfectly why, in order to plan for such a large-scale economy with trillions of different products, much like achieving their 5-year plan of the Soviet Union, you can't have individual communes across an entire country, as each will move off in different directions, which deviates from the plan. If you have to plan production for a population of 70 million people, you have to have that central government that oversees the plan. After all, the goal and intention is to reach their egalitarian utopia. Prices are complex. Check out my video on profits and losses where I explain the role that information plays and why, in the absence of profits and losses, you cannot possibly work out production. A free market economy is not faced with the economic calculation problem simply because the free market is consumer driven. This means that prices in the marketplace are left free in the market, regulated by the laws of supply and demand, left to fluctuate in relation to consumer demand. This free-flowing fluctuation correlates to consumer behavioural patterns. Consumer demand constantly changes throughout time, and in relation to what other products exist, the quantity and supply and ratio of consumer demand. Take, for example, when new technology comes out. The company DJI are a perfect example. A fundamental problem in Mouthy Infidel's argument on the labour theory of value, he doesn't understand the fact that Karl Marx viewed value in relation to price as endogenous rather than something exogenous. Value in relation to price isn't fixed, and there are external factors that influence value. I must point out, however, that it was a mistake on my part to correlate the subjective theory of value with Adam Smith, and rather should have correlated that with Ludwig von Mises. The free market understands the information of what to produce and stop producing simply by consumers freely shopping around for goods. They can tell that information by their most bought products and the least bought products, which tells them that information of profits and losses. The reason producers understand consumers' needs and wants is because through their free choice and transactions, they're telling producers their preferences for that time period. Socialism is not based on consumers driving production, it is based on central planning of production. That means consumers are taken out of the equation. And since socialism removes consumer demand and does not allow for prices to free flow and fluctuate in relation to consumer demand, it simply means there is no possible way for such advanced technology to know such information of consumer demand. Technology isn't a mind reader. You could have all the technology, watch and analyse your actions, but even this isn't socialism. It reverts back to consumer demand driving the economy, and that is capitalism. It defies central planning of the economy. Hypothetically speaking, even if you were to go with Vicky 1999's argument that the collective will go to the central planner and ask what they want produced, simply asking collectively doesn't provide the information for calculating production. Through collective decision making, you could guesstimate a number of each product you require for the week or month. but even then there is no way to tell exactly how much you require. You can't just guess, as this will result in the probability of overusing said resources and overproducing, creating surplus waste. In relation to this, Kevin D. Williamson touches upon an important point. He says, unquote, "When central planners say they are considering all the options and taking all the information into account, they are never telling the truth. They do not know what all the options are, because they cannot know. But even if the planners had some miraculous way to consider all the options and to take all of the information into account, where would they get the information? They could send out surveys to every household asking them about their milk consumption preferences for the following year. But would they get accurate answers? Probably not. People often lie on opinion surveys, providing answers that simply communicate what they imagine to be some desirable quality about themselves. For instance, newspaper companies terrified about their declining readerships frequently survey Americans about what they want in the newspaper, and the answers usually are 1. More foreign news, 2. More in-depth investigative reporting, 3. More cultural news. In truth, the most read sections of the newspaper are 1. Obituaries, 2. Sports scores, 3. Letters to the editor. In other words, consumers' stated preferences are at odds with their revealed preferences. We say we want to watch culturally enriching PBS programmes, but we actually watch American Idol. Off quote. The reason the free market knows the information of how much to produce of each product is based off the information they gathered from their profits. That information can only be determined by consumer demand, and it requires the information of prices to determine what gets produced and what not. The only way you could know this information is if price information signals exist in the first place. Again, Kevin D. Williamson addresses the problem central planners are faced with, even if using advanced technology, which debunks Paul Cockshot's theory. He says, unquote, "There are 115 million households in the United States. If we imagine a weekly milk consumption budget for each of them, that's 5.98 billion household weeks to plan for. Adding in a fairly restrictive list of variables, call it 0 to 20 quarts a week, 4 levels of fat content, organic, non-organic, soy, dairy, and 3 flavour options. You end up with around 6 trillion options to choose from. These are the choices facing our committee of central planners, and let's just assume that our central planners are the best and brightest that our world has to offer, with the temperaments of angels, totally unswayed by the quotidian concerns of politics or the influence of the various competing dairy lobbies. For instance, let's assume they are not human beings as we know them to exist, and that they have at their disposal a vast array of top-flight supercomputers. If they took just 1 second to consider each of these options, it would take them 198,128 years just to run through the possibilities of 1 year's milk consumption in the United States. Off quote. As you can see, regardless of technology, no matter how advanced it is impossible for central planners to calculate just 1 year's milk consumption, never let alone the trillions of different products out there in the market. How can central planners, even if supercomputers, calculate without information of prices? There is no information to calculate. You could guess calculation, but that isn't going to get you accurate results. Theoretically speaking, even if there was the collective decision making to have said quantity produced of each product you require, you're still guessing. There is no information to tell you who will use more. The price you gather from consumer demand told you what consumers want and don't want. If you remove the price information signals, you're screwed. You no longer hold such vast information. A better way to explain this in relation to Vicky 1999's theory of people asking the central planner is to compare people thinking up what they want produced to consumers shopping around. What is the difference? Your mind cannot possibly remember everything. You often forget things. You could argue about people writing things down, but what socialists ignore is when people go out shopping for specific things, they often come across things, not only what they forgot about, but they come across items they weren't otherwise aware of. And that may influence how they spend their money. There is no possible way, even for a collective commune, to sit down and collectively decide production for a vast society and economy with 1,000,001 different products. It's too much information. There are far too many products and options available, and from that example, there are products out there consumers are completely unaware of. If you look deeper into the options of resources available, there is a wide variety, such as renewable and non-renewable. I've argued in previous videos in relation to climate change, but one thing I did not touch upon is the unreliability to depend solely upon renewable resources to power our economy for energy. Take solar powered energy as a prime example. Sunlight isn't constant, especially in a country like Scotland that gets a lot of overcast and dull weather and currently doesn't generate anywhere near the same amount of power you gather from non-renewable resources such as fossil fuels, etc. The scarce natural resources which we heavily depend upon, such as oil, have such a vast array of alternative uses. We don't just depend upon oil for transportation, but food, bags, clothing, heating, among countless other things. You can't just overuse such a scarce resource by overproducing and allocating that resource into parts of the market where demand isn't there, and this is the fatal flaw of socialism. Consumer demand is fundamentally important, but more so are the prices determined by consumer demand. Destroy that information, you can forget about economic efficiency altogether.